Okay, today I'll be showing you how to set up a clutch on a Shepherd V-Lox V8.2. Most of the clutches in other brands are pretty much identical these days, so you'll be able to use this method on other brands. But also I use the same method on 1/10 cars as well. So pretty much what you see here is something that I've been doing for about 25 years of racing. Extremely reliable and consistent clutch every single time I use it. This is basically the standard clutch that now comes with the Shepherd V8.2 kits. Comes standard with the aluminium clutch bell, and also comes standard with the yellow clutch shoe, which is a softer clutch shoe. So the good thing about Shepherd now is pretty much everything you see there is all included in the kit, which isn't the case with some other brands. Today I'll be using some digital clutch tools to set up the clutch, but you can also use the standard tools as well if you don't have these. Using a Hassi engine, which is a Swiss modified OS engine, 21 engine for 8 scale. So I'll be installing it on this engine. First things first is use the cone that comes with the engine. Sometimes I'll actually put some shims behind the cone, and the reason why I do that is it eliminates the amount of shims I use for the end play. A bit of a personal preference for me, not something that's necessary, but something that you can basically do. So first things first is obviously the flywheel goes onto the engine, onto the cone basically, which is pretty straightforward, and then tighten in this nut onto it. Now I've seen a lot of people use tools like this to tighten the flywheel. Definitely don't recommend that, and the reason why I don't recommend that is it can cause these pins here to bend, which isn't good, but also I've seen times where they've actually broken the pins as well. So don't recommend using these tools to tighten the flywheel. What I do recommend are non-scratch pliers. So these ones are from Tamiya, and basically best thing to use because you're not going to be touching these pins at all when you tighten in that nut. So put that on like such and give it a good tight. Yep. That's pretty straightforward. So flywheel's now on. Next thing that goes on are the flyweights. Now these on the Shepherd come in one piece, so you need to cut them into the 3 pieces of basically where you see the line. So they come like that. Make sure you cut them. Obviously make sure you clean up the edges as well. I've already cleaned up the edges on this, but also what's very important also is to make sure they pivot freely on the pins. So if they don't pivot freely on these pins, just give them a slight file or a slight ream to ensure they pivot. They've got markings on each of the flywheels, and the reason why they have the marking is if you wanted to add weights, so little grub screws, to give yourself a more aggressive clutch. I've tried it, don't like it. I find it makes the clutch way too aggressive, so my personal preference is I don't use any grub screws on the flyweights. So basically install the 3 flyweights as such onto the flywheel. Next is the pressure plate, which is again a new modified item from Shepherd, extremely light. Goes straight on. That should pivot straight on, just obviously make sure. And then next goes the yellow clutch shoe. So again, making sure that this pivots. I've checked all this prior to putting it on, but if you find that the clutch shoe is tight, then again just obviously ream out the 3 holes on the clutch shoe. That goes in as such. Next is the cup that holds the flywheel and the spring into place. That slips straight on, and again nice and free. Now the Shepherd clutch that comes with the kit is extremely good, used by many other brands. It's out of the box, it's 10.8 mil. When it gets down to about 10 mil is when I usually change them over. So I recommend keeping an eye on the actual length of the spring. When it gets to about 10 mil, it's time to change it. There is another spring that we've been using lately, which is a safety model spring. Now this spring is extremely hard, used by some world champions, very popular in Europe. We sell it. It's called the safety car model clutch spring. Very, very hard, very, very strong. Recommend it on high grip conditions because it does definitely give your clutch quite a bit of an explosiveness to it. So something optional to use, but in 90% of cases, the Shepherd clutch spring is by far the one that we recommend. That slips on. Again, you need to make sure that the spring itself is I guess free on the actual nut. Occasionally you might find if it's not, just to give it a bit of a file on the inside of the spring, just to make sure it pivots nicely on the nut, which this one does perfectly. Next thing is the clutch nut, which is this thing here. Now I tend to put a little dab of Loctite on the thread here, and the reason for that is just to make sure it doesn't loosen itself during operation. So there's already a bit of Loctite on that goes straight on, and just using a clutch nut tool as such, you just want to give that a good tighten. As such. Now this is where we need to measure the clutch spring. So with a new clutch system, it's important that you break in and bed the clutch shoe. I've seen a lot of people just basically go from start, you know, on a standard clutch, and they burn out the clutch shoe. It's important that you run the clutch shoe in. Now the normal settings, or the optimal settings that I use on the clutch, are 1.8 mil clutch spring. However, on the new clutch, I set it at 1.4, and I do that at 1.4 for about 2 tanks, just so the clutch spring and the clutch engagement is nice and light on the shoe to bed it in. After 2 tanks of fuel, then I'll set it to 1.8. Using the clutch tool, you need to zero it off on a flat table, and then it's fairly straightforward. Pushing that down, and look at that, 1.4 mil. So I'll just back that off a little bit because it's a new clutch. Get it to about 1.4. Let's have a look at that again, and there you go, 1.4 spring. That's now set. So the next thing I do is I set the end play, and the way I set the end play is a little bit different. So basically I use the front bearing only of the clutch, so that goes in. Sometimes it's a little bit tight and you need to use a thing like a bearing tool just to make sure it goes in nice and easy, which that one has. Thrust nut holder goes on next. Now I'll put a couple of washers in there just to, I guess, give me a bit of a baseline reading. With the clutch, with the thrust bearing, important that the smaller one, so there's a 5.2 mil and a 5 mil thrust bearing, the smaller one goes on the outer end. So usually you can tell by feel. If you can't tell by feel, then just measure them with some calipers. So that one there is the one with less play, and there's a smaller one. Thrust bearing, doesn't really matter what direction the thrust bearing goes. I tend to put the balls outside. It's something I've been doing for years. And then the bigger one goes on as such. Insert that into your clutch bell and tighten that up. As such. Now, there's 2 ways you can measure end play here. You can use the standard tool, which most people have, so we'll try that out. 0.5. That's 0.5. I can measure that also on some digital tools as well. So it's just a matter of pushing it down, setting it to 0, and pushing it up. That's about 0.5 as well, so both tools are identical, and that's what I'll tend to basically run with the end play on a new clutch. The optimal settings for end play are 0.7 gap. Because it's a new clutch, I'm running a lighter spring and I'm running a smaller gap. So 0.5 gap is good enough to get you going for 2 tanks. After 2 tanks, once I've broken in the clutch shoe, then I'll adjust the recap. I'll adjust the clutch spring to 1.8, and I'll adjust the gap to 0.7. So now that we know, that's pretty fluky. Now that I know that the end play is 0.5, and again, if you need to increase the end play, you remove these shims, and obviously if you want to decrease it, you add more shims. Now that we've got the end play sorted, next is to adjust the play on the clutch. Now I use the bearings with a flange in them, so these are flange bearings, and the reason why I use them, I feel that it makes the clutch bell spin a little bit truer, but also it eliminates the amount of washers you need to use behind. So put that on, install it all back together, give that a tight. Now you want 0.1 of a gap, or 0.1 of play on the clutch, and I can tend to tell by hand, but you can also use the tools if you wanted to. There's not much end play on that. Let's have a look. It's about 0.7, so it's okay. You can probably get away with it. You wouldn't want to go any less than that. It will obviously increase once you run it, so keep an eye on it, because the more play you have on that clutch, the more damage you can do to your thrust bearing. So that will tend to get bigger and bigger during the day. 0.7 is probably the minimum. As I said, I wouldn't go any less than 0.7 on that. The only other things I recommend to do is to obviously grease up the thrust bearing. Very important that you grease up the thrust bearing with a little bit of grease. I use the Shepherd thrust bearing grease, just a dab of that, usually once before a race meet and once before a final. I find is more than enough. And that's basically how I set up the clutch on a Shepherd Velox 8.2.